The 25th of October 1415 would become a date that would shake the foundations of medieval Europe and change the course of warfare. Forever modern historians and archaeologists are now revealing the true story behind one of the most shocking military victories in history. While reenactors today recreate the famous battle with longbows and armor, scholars across Europe are making groundbreaking discoveries about what really happened on that muddy field in northern France. Recent research shows the Battle of Agincourt from a new perspective, revealing the brutal reality of medieval combat and the incredible military tactics that led to one of the most devastating defeats in French history. At the time when the English attacked, there was chaos in France. There was disease in the camp. When the English came, it was like divine intervention. They'd been pushed into a narrow field, and they'd been very seriously traumatized at death. The bodies were very damaged, limbs missing, heads severed. The skeletal remains show clear evidence of massive trauma marks. As you see, there's a clean cut through the skull right here. The story of Agincourt takes us to the fields of northern France here. A team of historians have been studying the landscape of one of medieval Europe's most famous battles. The research has revealed amazing details about the terrain and tactics that turned the history of medieval warfare on its head. Professor Anne Curry has studied one of the most important military engagements known to experts today. The remains of armor, weapons, and the accounts of eyewitnesses were examined in 2015 during the 600th anniversary of the battle. We can say for sure that it was a catastrophic defeat and that there was enormous slaughter. I mean thousands of bodies on the French side. That says it all. The battle had to be devastating. We can see terrible wounds described in the chronicles. Some, for example, had pierced armor and crushed skulls. So it was brutal, and they had to deal with those corpses quickly. Researcher Dominique Fontaine is studying the remains of medieval armor and how the soldiers died. The artifacts all showed signs of violent combat and multiple penetrating wounds. The breastplate has been pierced in several places. There are more than 3 punctures in the metal. The arrow trajectory or impact angle could have been something like that, because some of the dents are in the same direction at the same angle. And then the position has changed when the team from France applied modern forensic techniques to the battlefield. They were shocked by what they found. Analysis of the site, including soil samples and metal fragments, shows the extent of the carnage. Incredibly, the number of French dead may have reached 3,000 or more. Yet the English army numbered only around 6,000 men. The battlefield evidence proves that the French nobility suffered catastrophic losses. These thousands of bodies show that medieval warfare was far more brutal than scholars previously believed. We can be sure that these men were French knights who somehow met their death at Agincourt. As we shall see, the 100 Years' War was one of incredible violence, and the ferocious battle that raged in the mud of Agincourt must have been horrific. If thousands of armored knights were cut down and then buried in mass graves, I think that during battle the French cavalry charged. They were attacked from the front with arrows, and maybe they fell down. They were fighting, probably because the wounds are in the front of the armor. But in my opinion, this breastplate, the chest, was somehow exposed, because you cannot make the punctures like this, that they are at the same angle more or less. And finally, I found this greave, one of the leg protections I show you, which also means that he should have been dismounted or something, because the leg is down here. And of course the final blow has been this terrible wound. In my opinion, historical evidence in England confirms that King Henry V had been planning this campaign for months before he sailed to France in August 1415. Professor Anne Curry is a researcher in late medieval history at the University of Southampton, England. No one knew what was in the English war chest. Everyone knew that somewhere across the Channel they could win back territories, and that glory could be gained in unimaginable quantities. And it was this desire between reclaiming lost lands and proving English military might that was the first to be pursued by Henry V here at Southampton, on the shores of the Solent River. Documentary evidence shows that English soldiers and ships gathered here long before any mention of the campaign in the written chronicles. With regards to Southampton, we can see that military preparations dating back to before the expedition have been documented in the records of all the southern ports in the area of Southampton. The ancient chronicles known as the Gesta Henrici Quinti and accounts by French chroniclers have given a detailed picture of these men, whose exploits shocked all of Europe. They were the English longbowmen. They were men who left the safety of their island to challenge the greatest military power in Europe from the fields of Normandy to the gates of Paris. The English spread not only fear, but also a challenge to the established order of chivalry. The mystery of why Henry invaded France, and how he won has now been revealed. English kings had been claiming the French throne since the 1330s. By 1415, Henry V had decided to enforce those claims. With military force, he landed in Normandy with around 12,000 men and laid siege to the port of Harfleur. Well, I'm sure initially Henry came with specific goals, and that would have been the first objective. And the first objective would certainly have been on that level. And he would have been finding out what resistance was like in France as a result of that, however. And you get the siege succeeding, showing that kind of determination, the degree to which it did or didn't become a larger campaign. We now know here at Harfleur on the Normandy coast the way the English besieged the town is clearly documented. What happened to the garrison remains well known. The siege lasted 5 weeks. Sometime in September 1415, soldiers from England came here, and the French defenders surrendered. The term Agincourt really only applies to the final confrontation, which came after that initial successful siege, which may be in Normandy perhaps, only represented the first phase of a much larger ambition. I don't think it's as black and white as either you were there for conquest and glory, or you were there for ransom and profit and had your own motivations, or whatever it was that drove you. I'm sure that all these motivations were mixed up together. And it's not clear-cut. The English probably used intimidation tactics to force coastal communities in Normandy to surrender for weeks before they began their march toward Calais, where they hoped to return home safely. But they did not come for conquest alone. A titanic struggle was underway, pitting the young English king against the established power of the French monarchy. The muddy fields of Agincourt lie between the towns of Tramecourt and Agincourt. Today, the site is marked by a memorial and information center. In the distance, the woods that flank the battlefield still stand close enough for visitors to imagine the narrow corridor where the battle took place. No one expected the devastating English victory of the 25th of October 1415. Chronicler Jean Lefebvre commented, "Behold the flower of French chivalry, cut down in the mud, the greatest nobles of France lying dead upon the field, a disaster more complete than any in living memory." Jean Lefebvre, however, was an eyewitness to one of the greatest military shocks of the medieval period. The French army outnumbered the English by at least 2 to 1, possibly more. Inevitably, French chroniclers were devastated by the defeat. But according to Anne Curry, the lead researcher at the University of Southampton, the French may have been overconfident at that time. The French were dealing with civil war. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions were fighting for control, and the French army, well, their commanders were divided by politics. The first mistake was at the planning stage. So one theory is that the battle was lost before it even began. We shall see that the English victory was the result of careful planning, superior tactics, and French mistakes when politics in France created division. And when the terrain favored the English, the opportunity for victory became real. The French were confident they would crush them. Small English army and the potential for capturing valuable prisoners for ransom seemed certain. Henry V had been campaigning since August, and by October his army was exhausted and diminished by disease. They were trying to reach Calais, less than 5,000 men, mostly archers, against a French army of perhaps 20,000. The great forest of Agincourt funneled both armies into a narrow, muddy field. In October 1415, French knights in full armor advanced on foot and on horseback toward the English lines. The chroniclers stayed behind and watched the carnage. The French attacked in waves, but the narrow field prevented them from using their superior numbers. The next wave too became bogged down in the mud. In 1415, the muddy field of Agincourt itself became a death trap. The English archers rained arrows on the French knights, who could barely move. We can't ignore the shock and the slaughter, but nor can we see the battle between the English and the French as only this. There were also other factors, including terrain and weather, as well as other elements such as tactics, discipline, and leadership. When they found the French advance faltering, the English archers joined the melee with swords and mallets, finishing off the immobilized knights. France was the most powerful kingdom in Europe. At the time, the French army stretched from the Flemish border to the fields of Picardy. It was divided into 3 battles or divisions, constantly competing for glory and honor. While the vanguard was composed of the greatest nobles, including the Constable of France Charles d'Albret, the Duke of Alençon, and the Duke of Bar, divided by pride and mutually hindered by the terrain, they were unable to coordinate their attack against what initially was little more than a desperate English defensive position. The experienced French knights were no match for the discipline English archers. In 1415, the longbowmen of Henry V stood their ground and began a slaughter that would be remembered for centuries. They killed thousands of French nobles, including the constable and dozens of great lords. They practiced systematic killing on those who fell in the mud after the initial volleys disabled the French cavalry, and marched on to win one of the most shocking victories in military history. Agincourt became a symbol of English military prowess for generations. But what the history books tell us isn't always the complete story, says Anne Curry, the director of research on the battle. We talk about the sources for Agincourt as being both English and French, so you have the English perspective and that French perspective, and it's very difficult to reconcile those sometimes. So it already looks like we're dealing with a more complicated situation than, say, the traditional narrative would lead us to believe. The memorial center at Agincourt holds significant artifacts from the period, such as arrowheads, which were a typical weapon of the English archers, but also French armor was found in collections, while these accounts from eyewitnesses were found in archives across Europe. After devastating the French nobility, Henry captured Harfleur, an important strategic port in Normandy. This field at the edge of Agincourt village, and below the monument, is what is left of the battlefield today. Here, in the soil, fragments of metal, mostly arrowheads, were found scattered around a wide area dated to 1415 by their design. It was the year Henry shocked Europe. Nearby at Tramecourt, hundreds of French knights suggest that this was where the French army assembled in the same year. One of the French commanders, the Duke of Orleans, was captured and spent 25 years in English captivity. The English were here to make a statement, but despite what the English chroniclers wrote, the impact on France was relatively limited. We're not talking a decisive end to the war or anything like that, say for the immediate shock into the French court. But I'd be very surprised if anybody estimated that this was the end of French military power. Henry, King of England, the only English monarch to come so close to claiming the French throne, defeated a much larger French army at Agincourt. But the campaigns continued for nearly 7 years, with the English drawing on help from Burgundy, where the Duke had allied with them. The English army campaigned tirelessly and almost successfully until Henry himself died. 1422, and his infant son inherited both kingdoms. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, would have given England control of France, where Henry's heirs would rule. But the peace did not last, however, as French resistance from supporters of the Dauphin also continued in the following years. As we shall see, events in France and Burgundy continued to influence the patterns of warfare. Henry's military success left England better positioned to dominate France. He instituted systematic conquest and a series of garrison towns, known as strongholds, where the English army could maintain control when occupying territory. England's military efficiency assured the loyalty of Norman lords. The many sort of glances across to English-held territories is because of its well-organized administration, and there are ways of securing people out of their traditional allegiances. And that obviously comes with the fact that you get this trickle-down effect from the central power, call it king, to the way that and is distributed. That patronage buys loyalty. France, too, continued to be subject to attacks by English armies. In 1417, Henry returned to Normandy to capture Caen, an important Norman city in the heart of traditional French territory. The population was subdued, and the region was brought under English control on the northern coast of France. The English besieged Rouen, the capital of Normandy, in the year 1419, when the city finally surrendered after months of starvation. Although the great victory at Agincourt had shocked Europe, the campaigns by Henry and other commanders continued creating new realities, such as the English occupation of Normandy, famous for its resistance later, in 1429 Denmark and other kingdoms. The territorial expansion of powerful dynasties pushed nobles who sought advantage to change sides, seeking their fortune. In war, the richer the rewards, the more they invested in armies and sieges to mount ever larger campaigns. Each French region had its own allegiance until the ruler of this strategic position along France's heartland used diplomatic power to unite those who opposed English rule in 1422. Henry V died, suddenly ending the first phase of English dominance. What is certain is that all of Henry's conquests were threatened by his early death, and even though all territories were held on his son's behalf, the infant Henry VI himself had no control in these two kingdoms. What was happening in the French heartland affected the extent of English power in the north and south. The English occupation of France was driven by politics, as well as by desire for territory. Opponents to English rule, those who saw no profit in accepting Henry VI and serving as subjects in his kingdom, may have taken to resistance and supporting the Dauphin. Instead, the hundreds of castles were perfect places to defend, and resisting the English armies or supporting the Burgundian alliance must have seemed more attractive than serving an infant. Foreign King French nobles served as commanders for both sides and were rewarded with lands, creating the way for conflicts further into the heart of France. They brought home not only plunder, but also ambitions to restore French sovereignty in their own lands. In 1429, politics in France led to a turning point in the war, defeated by years of English success. A peasant girl, Joan of Arc, claimed divine guidance and rallied French forces. The nobles of France who had accepted English rule began to waver and elected to support Charles VII in his place at Reims Cathedral. The Dauphin was crowned king, terrifying the English into strategic retreat. The French resistance gained momentum after Joan's intervention. So, if we think about Joan of Arc, she is the catalyst of the turning point in 1429. And it's around about 1435 into the 1440s that we see a whole new phase of French recovery. The area of English control in France now, it really is shrinking rapidly, and that then continues right through into the 1450s. We have to bear in mind how medieval societies developed. They themselves were the result of interaction between different factions. But this too is subject to debate, because we can't imagine that all the impetus for change comes from military victories, as has been said, but there were developments within French society. Two French commanders learned from their defeats. They themselves were the students of hard lessons from battles like Agincourt and the disasters of the early 15th century, and a transformation in French military thinking. These two developments, with their emphasis on artillery and professional armies, were perfect foundations for recovery into a stronger France and a reversal of English fortunes. A large number of cannons found on former battlefields, now on exhibition in Paris museums, show how effective new technology was, and how even from the earliest times the French sought the most powerful weapons available at the time. Gunpowder, artillery, and professional soldiers. They built or bought cannons, siege engines, and new fortifications. The French had been losing battles and territory for decades before their military reforms were implemented in the years following Agincourt. As far as military technology, today the widespread belief is that the development of gunpowder weapons in France is linked to their determination to reverse English gains that goes back to the 1430s, between the 1430s and 1450s. So, in those 2 decades, a complete transformation in French military capability was achieved. There were no distinctions between defensive and offensive warfare. One day, they were defending towns and castles, the next besieging those same English strongholds. One such commander was a certain French officer, Jean Bureau, who disclosed to King Charles VII what the military strategies of modern warfare were. He described campaigns in Normandy and down into Gascony in search of final victory and total expulsion of the English. He described the systematic recapture of Normandy and the military routes into Bordeaux. Another development, the use of professional standing armies, proved the extent of French determination between recovering lost territory among the places French forces recaptured. was the great city of Rouen, whose siege in 1449 marked the beginning of the end. As I said, Rouen was besieged by the French newcomers on the frontier with English-held Normandy, and the objects which we found in sieges are mainly cannons, but we have also evidence, written records from French sources, and also accounts made by English defenders. The French commanders dominated this Norman capital, turning it into a symbol of resurgent French power, turning it into a staging ground to supply armies on their expeditions deep into English-held territories. Alongside articles of war, Jean Bureau found a large quantity of support from the population. Rouen was a hub of French recovery. In my opinion, we see a sort of national awakening. We find the same determination, the same royal support, the same professional armies everywhere from Normandy to Gascony. So there was some kind of unification, and this unification was fostered by military success and leadership here in Normandy. Local populations supported French forces, made weapons, supplied food and labor. In the war effort, the military campaigns stretched all along the northern coast from Cherbourg to the Garonne River, where Bordeaux stands today. The English garrisons who had occupied this vast area lived in fortified towns and used defensive strategies. They were systematically defeated by the resurgent French. On the other hand, there is a widespread belief that the largest factor in English defeat was not just French military revival with the aid of new technology, but also war weariness. It is even said that by the 1440s, the English Parliament was tired of funding endless wars in France. The French turned their military victories into permanent reconquest, where commanders rewarded them for loyalty. The French forged new determination between leadership and population in 1449, while in Normandy, the French were recapturing Rouen. A French army also moved south and liberated Bordeaux. They were supported by the local population of present-day southwest France to give them final victory. The finds here at Castellan, just east of Bordeaux, show a significant English last stand. The English artifacts that have been found in the Bordeaux area are connected both to final desperate battles. We find not only weapons, but also evidence of a last major English field army, which suggests that the English made one final attempt. The impressive rivers and valleys of southwest France, where the heart of the final English defeats the Dordogne River, is still a beautiful waterway, and the Garonne River flows into it, rising in the Pyrenees further south. The countryside in southwest France is one of the regions that still today shows evidence of the final campaign's weapons, such as swords and armor. From Castellan show that this was not only a significant battle, but also the end of English ambitions. We have to say that the Battle of Castellan in 1453 was the final major engagement. While smaller sieges and skirmishes continued for some time, we should also say that France had achieved what seemed impossible after Agincourt: complete recovery, mainly, and the English were expelled from all territories except Calais. 70 years after the shock of Agincourt, the English had lost everything they had gained. The most persistent myth about Agincourt is that it decided the war. It proved English superiority. It was a great triumph. They always celebrated the victory, and so on, but the truth is that it was a temporary success, no better or worse than other victories at that time. They did fight in a brutal war. The year 1453 was a turning point in the story of the 100 Years' War. The era of English dominance was over, and French recovery had reached its completion. But it was also the beginning of a century of new conflicts. The freebooting English adventurer faded away, and in their place, great French monarchs, kings of a united country, who would build the power of France against new enemies and against each other. Into the early modern period, more transformation than at any time in the preceding centuries. Rich, centralized royal power dominated Western Europe. Their leaders learned the craft of state building from their struggles and built nations that are still with us today.